Hi everyone, it's Scott again. It's only been a couple of days since my last video. I wrapped up the Oda Nobunaga series of videos that I wanted to do. And the plan is next to do a series of videos on Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who pretty much picked up where Oda Nobunaga left off. But before I did that, and kind of in interest of making this series more active, I wanted to do something of a little, epilogue about Nobunaga and sort of an appraisal of him. And what really inspired me was, when I was consulting the Lammers book, the biography of Nobunaga that I've mentioned several times. I linked to it in my last video, and I've talked about it before in my other videos about Nobunaga. He makes a lot of references to the work of Niccolo Machiavelli and how Nobunaga in a lot of ways embodies a lot of the qualities that Machiavelli advises leaders to have. And, as someone who's, I'm getting my doctorate in political science, I'm a government student, scholar, I'm an aspiring academic in this field. I know, about Machiavelli, I've read The Prince, and I thought it would be interesting to sort of look into this more. And of course, as soon as I started doing research for this online, I found that Lammers had actually already written a short article about this, where he compares Nobunaga to some of the things that Machiavelli recommends in The Prince. But I thought I would go ahead and make this video anyway, and do a couple of things, namely expand a little more on Machiavelli and what he's all about, what The Prince is famous for, if you're not familiar with him or his work. And also talk a little bit more about some of the qualities that Nobunaga had and some of the specific instances from his life where he did, in fact, seem to follow the advice of Machiavelli, although, of course, he never read Machiavelli or would have been exposed to the work of Machiavelli. Machiavelli actually lived and wrote before the time period we think of when we think of Oda Nobunaga. Machiavelli was born in 1469, he dies in 1527, and obviously the Battle of Okayama, which is kind of when Nobunaga really becomes this, kind of comes into his own or sort of gains national attention in Japan. That's not until 1560. But Machiavelli grew up in a very different environment. He grew up in Italy, which was starting to sort of come out of sort of the medieval feudal period, or starting to transition into the Renaissance era. Florence, you may know, was under the control of the Medici merchant family for a long time. It was basically a one-man state. The Medici, whoever the patriarch of the Medici clan was the sole ruler of Florence. Events transpired, however, in 1494, a war involving France. The Medicis were on the wrong side. They were deposed, and Florence became a republic, which it had been in the past. And around this time in 1498, Machiavelli starts to go to work for the Florentine government, working as sort of a diplomat. He does some intelligence work for them as well, and he basically travels around northern Italy. He meets some pretty famous figures like Leonardo da Vinci. He becomes familiar with Cesar Borgia. If you've ever seen the Borgia's TV show, where you've played video games like Assassin's Creed 2, you might be familiar with some of these figures. And I believe Machiavelli actually features in that particular video game. Of course, it's not very historically accurate, but you might have some, knowledge of who he is and where he fits into this time period. So Florence actually doesn't last as a republic. There's a war involving Spain, I believe, where Florence sides with France. Florence loses, and the Medicis are reinstalled. It's back to sort of an autocratic rule. The republic is abolished, and Machiavelli is sent into exile. And this really just devastates him, because he lives and breathes to be a political animal. And, he can't stand the idea of being sidelined. And so while he's in exile, he writes this book, which is, we know is The Prince today. And in it, he writes this in 1513. And in it, he dedicates the work to the Medicis. And it's basically his hope that he'll get work by writing this book, even though he himself is a Republican. And we know later when he writes the Discourses, his second most famous work, that he does have Republican values. In The Prince, he writes The Prince. It's sort of a genre of work that's very familiar during this period, where it's advice being given to a ruler on how best to rule. And in the Discourses, he makes it clear that it's not just a one man that needs to have these qualities or this way of thinking. Any nation, any kind of polity, independent polity, including a republic, needs to have them. It doesn't work. He doesn't get work with the Medici. Actually, Florence goes back to being a republic again. But in the meantime, Machiavelli is seen as being a little too close to the Medici. Or maybe he did, in fact, go back to work for them in a little bit. But essentially, when the Medici fall again, Machiavelli is seen as being not Republican enough, after being seen as too Republican, and he he dies in 1527 on the outs with the new Republic of Florence. So not a very happy ending for him. But let's talk about The Prince and sort of what it's about. And it's pretty misunderstood today. I mean, even today, the word Machiavellian, when used as an adjective, means someone who's deceitful or underhanded, or stabs you in the back, can't be trusted, or maybe they're even cruel without reason or purpose. But actually, it's not true, and that misunderstanding kind of comes from the fact that Machiavelli, as a Republican who admired ancient Rome, the Roman Republic specifically, he didn't really subscribe to a lot of the virtues or ideas or norms that had come to define his time period, which were very Christian in orientation, which preaches things like humility and honesty and morality. And Machiavelli very much believed that you could not be a merciful person or a humble person or a rigorously honest person and also be an effective ruler. So he preferred to look at sort of the ancient world and sort of the virtues, the ideas of what makes a good leader in those times, as opposed to what, for example, the church was saying in his own time. And that's where a lot of the controversy came later, and why his book was banned, and why he was seen by a lot of people as being, this outrageous, mouthpiece for tyrants. When in reality, he was a pretty, he was a humanist, he was a secular Republican, small R Republican guy. You can't really give him a lot of the modern ideas and values that we have today, obviously, because he was still a creature of the 16th century Renaissance period. But he simply, he didn't go along with what a lot of the things that were considered, proper or decent in his time period. And I actually have a short passage from The Prince that kind of sums up, I think, his advice that he gives, which is, men must either be pampered or crushed, because they can get revenge for small injuries, but not for grievous ones. So any injury a prince does a man should be of such a kind that there is no fear of revenge. And so that's kind of sums up what he believes, that it's better to be feared than loved, that you can't win over everybody, and there are gonna be times where you deal with a crisis or a potential problem, and it's better to be decisive and thorough and ruthless than to try to find some sort of middle ground, to be indecisive, to be too timid, to be too cautious. And he comes to promote this idea of virtu, which is not to be confused with virtue in the Christian sense, but virtu in the sense of being brave, being bold, being cunning. And Machiavelli actually talks about how a good leader will either make use of force, like a lion, be like a lion, to use unrestrained, sheer, unmitigated force, or to be like a fox and use cunning and deceits and intrigue to get your way. So he very openly says, these things that, make a lot of sense. The idea that, you have, it's better to be brave and bold and timid, and sometimes, if necessary, to be sneaky and hypocritical if the end, I wouldn't say the end justifies the means, but the means can be excused because the end is good, if that makes sense. So he encourages leaders to have this quality of being very bold and fearless and ruthless, and but he also talks a great deal about fortune, and he kind of frames fortune again in this ancient Roman kind of way, is where fortune is a goddess that can be influenced, it can be mastered. You can take sort of precautions against it, but ultimately there are simply factors in life that cannot be controlled, no matter who you are or where you are. And it kind of explains how two men or two people who are trying to pursue the same goal but take different strategies or use different tactics can end up achieving the same end, or how two people who use the same strategy and the same tactics, one wins and the other fails. It's sort of this whole winds of fortune type deal. And again, the idea is that fortune favors the brave, that, you can't control fortune, but if you exhibit these virtues of fortune, of being bold, seizing the day, carpe diem, being merciless and, just thoroughly ruthless when dealing with your enemies, then, you will prosper. And I mentioned that famous line, it's better to be feared than loved. And then by that he means, it's almost impossible to win the love of everybody. No matter how generous you are, you're not going to please everybody. Even if you are generous, you're probably going to incur, so much debt, or, your taxes are going to be so high to have the funds needed to be so lavish and generous and charitable that you'll end up, making the people you're taxing hate you, or, you'll send your state into bankruptcy. So it's much better, in his reasoning, to be feared. And by this, he doesn't mean hated. He doesn't mean, be mean, be cruel without purpose. And he actually talks about leaders who, whose crimes are so heinous that they cannot be forgiven or excused or pardoned. But, by feared, he sort of means how we think of police officers today. We often don't like police officers. We don't want a police officer to pull us over. And we don't really love police officers. We don't want to see them, pulling us over. But we do have a sort of fear of them. We don't hate them. We don't, want to go out and, get rid of them or whatever. Like when we're the victim of a crime or whatever, we want a policeman. And so we have this way of viewing policemen as, we understand what they're capable of doing. They have this authority over us. They can make our day very, bad if we want. But, we don't necessarily despise, police. We understand they have a function in society, and, that's a very important function, if that makes sense. And something else that Machiavelli talks about a lot is dealing with war. And another famous line that that's in The Prince is, war cannot be avoided. It can only be postponed to the benefit of others. And in this, he means, again, be decisive. If there's a threat that's out there and you have the means or the power to take it on, you should take it on, as opposed to, waffling about it. Be decisive. So that's Machiavelli in a nutshell. Those are the things he prescribes for a prince, a one-man ruler, to have those qualities. Again, if you read more about him, if you read about the discourses, he makes it clear that he thinks that these are qualities that should exist in a civic society of a republic. That every citizen should have these qualities and be prepared to do whatever is necessary for the interests of the republic, and so on. So the prince is not this, or his thinking rather is not this handbook for gangsters or tyrants that it's sometimes made out to be. So that's a very important historical lesson to take from that. And of course, you don't have to take my word for it. You can do your own research, and I encourage you. That's part of what the spirit of this whole thing's about, is everyone, going out and seeking knowledge and increasing their knowledge. So let's compare these lessons to or rather these prescriptions that Machiavelli has for to Nobunaga. And this whole idea of being bold, dealing ruthlessly and thoroughly with your enemies. I mean, there are just a lot of examples of that. I mean, Nobunaga very thoroughly deals with the monks on Mount Hiei in 1571. He sends his troops up the mountain and massacres every monk, every woman, every child he finds. And we know from his contemporaries that this was a very shocking thing, like how ruthless he was. And he does the same thing at Nagashima in 1574 when he defeats the Iko-Iki there. And again, on and on and on, he deals with them very, very, very thoroughly and very ruthlessly. And this is often distorted into to the point of oh, he's being cruel, he's being sadistic, even, like these are crimes against humanity, atrocities and so on. But really, no. I mean, he's being thorough in the sense that Machiavelli would have counseled, and that he's not that the thing I said about how if you're going to crush someone, you have to crush them with grievous wounds in a grievous way, because if you just harm them a little bit, they're going to come back and want revenge. And so if he had only killed 1/3 of the monks at Mount Hiei, or 1/3 of the Iko-Iki at Nagashima, they could have come back and gotten at him. And it's important, there are ways that Nobunaga could have been more cruel and more abused his power in many ways. One of the things he does in sort of like the early 1570s, when he's the benefactor of Ashikaga Yoshiaki, the shogun that he's restored to power, or he's put into power, he reprimands Yoshiaki a couple of times for using his position as shogun to steal pieces of property, parts of land. The shogunate was so on hard times by that point because of the Onin War. The shogun didn't have land that it could hand out to its friends, which was a very common practice, had been historically. So Yoshiaki would just take other people's land as shogun and then, keep it for himself or hand it out later. And Nobunaga, reprimands him for this. And it's interesting, Nobunaga could have just not cared. He could have done it himself if he wanted to. He wasn't the supreme warlord in Japan at this point, but he was, he had the power, as the power essentially in Kyoto, since Yoshiaki was pretty powerless on his own. The emperor was pretty powerless. The court was kind of just a ceremonial institution. But Nobunaga, I think he understood that if he acted in this way, if he just took people's lands away arbitrarily, then he wouldn't be, this would create enemies for him. And he had plenty of enemies as it was around this time. So he seemed to understand that, it was better to be feared than loved. And it was better to be ruthless if you got in his way and obstructed his ambitions. But he wouldn't just arbitrarily, treat you in a cruel fashion. It wasn't, cruelty for cruelty's sake or power for power's sake. It was the exercise of, force, to the extent that we might consider it cruel or atrocious, but it had a purpose behind it. There are also a lot of times where Nobunaga, again, acts, without any kind of sentimentality or any kind of sense of obligation to others. He's his longest really ally, the only person, in his kind of inner circle that has an independent power base, that's Tokugawa Ieyasu. There are several times where he almost doesn't help out Tokugawa Ieyasu and honor his alliance. In 1572, the Takeda are running rampant in Tokugawa territory, and Ieyasu asks Nobunaga for help, and almost, Nobunaga doesn't give it to him. And Ieyasu kind of has to say, if you don't help me out here, I'm going to join with the Takeda, and I'll be in the vanguard of the Takeda when they come and take you down. And it's really only when he makes these threats that Nobunaga's like, okay, fine, I'll send some forces to come and help you. And, I think this kind of indicates how much that Nobunaga, like, he's prepared to sort of throw these friendships or these alliances even to the winds. And, I think there's, like, you can't say that he was always like this, because there is that point where Nobunaga sends his sister and marries her to Azai Nagamasa, and in the hopes of securing a marriage alliance with the Azai, and kind of keeping them out, or, preventing them from attacking him. And I think after that happens, there's, like, nothing that, that makes Nobunaga think that he can cut a deal like that. When he is surrounded by his enemies, when he's dealing with the Azai, the Asakura, the Miyoshi, and the Takeda, he's like, bring it on. He doesn't shy away. He doesn't try to make marriage alliances. He doesn't try to broker, separate pieces or anything like that. He kind of takes Machiavelli's advice that you can't avoid war. You're just postponing it until it happens. And of course, there's also the thing about fortune. And I mean, Nobunaga is extremely fortunate, and mainly I'm thinking about the deaths of Takeda Shingen and I believe 1573, if I'm not mistaken, and the death of Yusuji Kenshin in 1578. They're not complete surprises. I mean, they wasn't really broadcast that their health wasn't super great before they died. But, we kind of know that it wasn't, assassinations or anything like that, some of the theories that are kind of put out there. Or at least it's not likely. But wow, I mean, like, Nobunaga does very, very well to avoid, battles with these clans at their full strength. I mean, obviously it's, I don't believe that either Shingen or Kenshin were as, the great general masterminds, the medieval Japanese Clausewitzes of their day or anything like that that's kind of put out there in popular culture. But they were extremely powerful. I mean, the Takeda had this huge, huge power base. They were steamrolling, westward when Shingen, dropped dead, and then they had to sort of reconsolidate themselves with Katsuyori, and we all know how that went, and Nagashino. And Kenshin just, dropping dead. Nobunaga, is extremely fortunate. He's, he has the goddess of fortune on his side in those respects. But he does take a lot of things that, precautions, that sort of influence fortune. And we can see that, I think it's best illustrated in his power base, or rather his inner circle of people, in that after 1574 especially, he doesn't really elevate anyone else up into his inner circle of his closest and top retainers. It's sort of the same 10 people. And I'm not including Tokugawa Ieyasu because he's not a retainer. He's his own lord. He's just allied with Nobunaga. But sort of the 10 that I'm thinking of in this close clique around under Nobunaga, there's his main deputies. You have Hideyoshi, Shibata Katsui, Maeda Toshie, Akechi Mitsuhide, Takegawa Kazumasu, Niwa Nagahide, Sasanari Masa, Akira Sunioki, Mori Nagayoshi, and Sakuma Nobumori. And almost all of those are people, they're retainers of the Oda family going all the way back to Owari. A couple of them, there's three really that don't really meet that distinction. There's Hideyoshi, who, comes from really humble peasant origins. He's from the Owari area, but he sort of wanders around a lot. Allegedly he works for the Imagawa for a time period before he enters Nobunaga's service. But he goes from being this lowly, sandal bearer messenger up to his general, one of his generals. And then you have Takegawa Kazumasu, who again is also kind of this vagabond figure who kind of enters into Oda's service, but again, follows him from a very early point in Nobunaga's rise to power. And then you have the really big outsider here, that's Akechi Mitsuhide. in that he's the only one who is of samurai stock, who comes from the Mino area, but he's not really in this tight inner circle. And sort of in my last video, I talked about how I was kind of skeptical of the idea that Hideyoshi was in on a conspiracy by Mitsuhide to overthrow and assassinate Nobunaga. And really, kind of what I said. I mean, I think in Hideyoshi it's a special case because he is, he's of lowly, very lowly stock. But really, when you think about it, all those 9, except for Mitsuhide, all basically owe their position to the Oda clan, Nobunaga in specifically, and they've stayed at the top of this ladder, at the top rung of this chain of command, and they're set. And I mean, yes, one of them, Sakuma Nobumori, does kind of get this really awful treatment where he's sent into exile on Mount Koya. He's basically sentenced to death essentially in this way. But was the death of one of these guys enough? I mean, I think it might have been enough for Akechi Mitsuhide, and I think Mitsuhide also realized, like, I can sort of exist outside this Oda clan structure. I really have no, close links to it personally. Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's hard to say. It's impossible to say. I mean, we'll never know. It's purely speculation at this point, but, for kind of the same reasons I doubt that Hideyoshi would have turned on Oda Nobunaga. I mean, I don't think that the Sakuma Nobumori incident was really enough, I think, for, like, any of those other guys besides Mitsuhide to sort of, go to the extent of treachery. And again, I'm not even really saying that it was causal, that it was the incident with Sakuma Nobumori that led Mitsuhide to do what he did. I think it was more of the fact that he was this outsider in this group of, these top 10 guys who were loyal to Nobunaga and who Nobunaga relied on, and entrusted with all his the main responsibilities. Now, in what ways did Nobunaga not really follow Machiavelli's advice? And it goes back to the whole more, it's better to be feared than loved, but you don't want to be hated thing. Because Nobunaga really seemed to not try to be loved at all. I mean, not even a little bit. He did definitely do the feared thing. He made people afraid of him. And, you can attribute the Sakuma Nobumori thing to that. And again, you can sort of see that as, instead of causing treachery, it could have been, a way to intimidate potential traitors. You could just as easily, if he had not been assassinated, people would say, oh, he was so smart to do this to Sakuma Nobumori because it made him that much more of a scary guy. And so we're talking about it being a reason for his assassination. But I'm thinking more of the fact that he never let any of his retainers, these top 10 guys, stay in one place for very long. He moved them around a lot. He was pretty openly contemptuous of them, like especially Hideyoshi. I mean, some of the correspondence we have of him where he calls Hideyoshi something like a shaved rat or a bald rat. He called him, monkey, Saru. We know from contemporary graffiti when Hideyoshi was regent that people called him the monkey regent. But yeah, I mean, Nobunaga, we know a lot of the stuff that's out there about Mitsuhide being mistreated in the sense of like, oh, his mother was Nobunaga sacrificed Mitsuhide's mother in a hostage exchange type deal. Like, that's not true. It's fake. But, we have no reason. He did apparently make fun of Mitsuhide's poetry. He said he wasn't a very good poet, and he made fun of his receding hairline. So I think you can say, I mean, as reluctant as a lot of people are, and by people I mean like people I've encountered on samuraiarchives.com and all that, they're reluctant to sort of buy into the whole Nobunaga was a committed atrocities and was like this demonic evil figure. Um, you know, it's pretty clear he was still a jerk. I mean, he was not nice to his followers. He was not nice to most of the top, these top 10 guys that I'm talking about. Hideyoshi and Mitsuhide kind of stick out there, but I'm sure it wouldn't surprise me if there was, stuff out there about how he mistreated Katsue or Toshiie and so on. Obviously, and of course, Sukuma no Momori, but that's kind of an outlier. Um, but again, none of them really rebelled. None of them rebelled against him until Mitsuhide did. And we obviously none of them said, "Hey, we're gonna rally to Mitsuhide's banner because he killed this jerk Nobunaga." Finally, they pretty uniformly allied against him, and but I think when the dust settles, Nobunaga's dead, but Hideyoshi defeats Mitsuhide at Namazaki. There's no real, I think, strong effort to save the Oda clan. The Oda clan, like the survivors of the Oda clan, quickly become pawns in these games between Hideyoshi and Shibata Katsui and Togawa Ieyasu, and deciding who's going to be the next successor, or the next power player, the big warlord in Japan, who's going to pick up where Nobunaga left off. But again, that's really not that uncommon in the Sengoku period. I mean, the idea of the low overtaking the high, and not honoring these things that you're supposed to honor to the extent that medieval Japanese samurai or whatever honored these things anyway. So yeah, Nobunaga, not a great guy to work for. He was a pretty dynamic leader, and I think that in terms of sort of tearing down all the opponents, obstacles there were to there being once again this sort of central power in Japan, this unifying force in Japan, Nobunaga was the guy. I mean, we'll never know what kind of ruler in peacetime he would have been because he didn't live that long. We don't even know what kind of system he envisioned or whatever for unified Japan. But in terms of like the qualities you need to take this fragmented, country or whatever, and to clear out all the obstacles ruthlessly with, willing to do whatever it takes to consolidate power into one centralized power, Nobunaga was that guy, and it's something that I don't think Hideyoshi would have been equal to. I mean, the fact that Hideyoshi was willing to make all these deals later, the fact that he was willing to pick a fight in Korea that was not necessary and ended up actually depleting a lot of the families that he would have needed or he did need to protect the Toyotomi family after he died. I think they kind of show that Hideyoshi wasn't the kind of guy that would have been able to do those things that Nobunaga did so ruthlessly. Hideyoshi, as we'll see when I get to him, was much more effective as a ruler, in terms of the drastic changes he made to the way, kind of the structure that had made medieval Japan so fractious and made it so rebellious, so that there couldn't be a centralized power without all these uprisings and infighting. He's really the guy with the sword hunt, and moving all the samurai into these urban areas, and making it so that you didn't have uprisings by peasants or by rebellious samurai. He really set the stage for a stable, rigid, centralized system. And then he dies. Tokugawa Ieyasu comes along, and very patiently and finishes it all off. And in some ways, I guess you could say Ieyasu kind of follows that same thinking. Although that's for another video where I talk about Ieyasu and sort of how he's kind of his main legacy is kind of just finishing up what Nobunaga and Hideyoshi had started, and then really isolating his new shogunate so that nothing more could happen to it. So that about does it for me and, you know, my Machiavelli Nobunaga episode. I'm thinking about also doing a non-Sengoku, you know, medieval Japan related video. It's 2017, obviously. It's the 100th anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And, you know, being a history buff, being interested in this period, having written about it before, I'm thinking about doing a video, or maybe even a series of videos about the Bolshevik Revolution, starting with the February 1917 and the October 1917 revolutions. I'm not sure if I just want to do that, but I find it such an interesting thing, and like how little people know about, you know, how the Bolsheviks came to power, you know, what roles that Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and, you know, these other old Bolsheviks, the main Bolshevik players, played in this role, in the unfolding of the revolution. And I guess also what's really misunderstood is the subsequent battle between Stalin and Trotsky and the other Bolsheviks, and how it's been sort of distorted, especially by, you know, partisans who like Trotsky and hate Stalin. So I'm thinking about doing those videos, or a video. You know, if you have any opinions, if you'd like to see that, if you think it's be a waste of time and you're only interested in the samurai stuff, you can tell me either in the comments of this video or on in the thread in the Samurai Archives message board. Please, you know, continue to support those guys. If you buy any books about this time period, please do it through their Amazon link. And if you haven't already, support their Patreon for the Samurai Archives podcast. So I will see you next time. Hopefully we'll be talking about Hideyoshi then. So, bye-bye.